Hey everyone, ever catch yourself flipping through news headlines about different countries and wondering, like, what even is a nation? We throw that word around, but, understanding what goes into it, all its different parts, it really helps you understand the world, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And honestly, it's way more interesting than you might think. The whole concept of a nation, even though it feels kind of basic, it's this wild mix of history, philosophy, and political science all rolled into one.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. We've got a ton of sources for this deep dive. Articles on global politics, some classic political theory, even some historical analysis, all pointing us towards, like, a better understanding of nations.
And more importantly, why it should matter to you. Because whether you realize it or not, this whole nation thing, it shapes your life in ways you probably don't even realize.
Totally. But where do we even begin with something this big? It's like, I don't know, trying to summarize the complete history of music in a single podcast or something.
Well, a good place to start is with the idea that nations, as we know them today, haven't always been around. Our sources point to this idea of gradual evolution. From small family units into villages, then those villages become city-states, and eventually those city-states, they kind of morph into these bigger nations.
Like a social evolution, right? From, like, small and simple to big and complex. But I'm guessing there are a bunch of different theories on why this happened, right?
You bet. Our sources really dive into some of the heavy hitters. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, each with their own spin on the whole social contract idea. That whole idea that people basically agree to give up certain rights in exchange for the protection and order a ruler or a state can provide.
Ah, yes, the social contract. Man, I am getting some college flashbacks right now. Turns out it wasn't just about showing up for class. Didn't Hobbes have kind of a bleak outlook on what life would be like without a social contract, though?
Oh, he did. He really did. Hobbes, he believed that a state of nature, without any central authority, would be absolutely brutal. He even called it a war of all against all. Imagine just a world where everyone's out for themselves, just constant fighting over, well, everything, resources, power, you name it.
Yikes, that sounds exhausting. No wonder people would be willing to give up some of their freedom for, I don't know, a little bit of security, right?
Yeah.
So Hobbes thought nations form because it's better than the alternative. Total chaos. What about Locke? What was his take?
Locke. He was all about individual rights, especially the right to own property. He thought people created governments to protect those rights, not just from other people, but from a government that might get a little power hungry.
So with Locke, it's less about dodging chaos and more about making a system that protects, like, the important stuff, our individual rights, like creating a rule book for how power is supposed to work. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And then you've got Rousseau, who, how do I put this? He kind of throws another log on the philosophical fire. His argument was that humans, we come together to chase a common good, a general will, something that's bigger than just what's mine or what's yours.
Okay, so less about self-preservation or individual rights and more about this, like, group effort to build something better for everyone. Interesting how these theories have such different takes on why we come together as nations, but why aside, I mean, we know nations did form, right? So let's get down to the basics. What is a nation?
Well, our sources point to a few things that are non-negotiable. Number one, you got to have a defined territory, and that's not just the land, but also the airspace above it, even the water surrounding the country.
So when we talk about a nation's territory, we're talking 3D here, land, sea, and sky. It's not just lines on a map, huh? But why is that so important?
Well, control over those spaces has become super crucial, especially in today's globalized world, impacting everything from trade and defense to things like environmental rules and how we manage resources. It's a nation's sphere of influence.
Okay, that makes sense. So you've got your territory, your little piece of the planet.
Yeah.
But a nation's nothing without its people, right?
Exactly. The people living there, their shared culture and history, their identity, it's what gives a nation its character, its story.
Yeah, it's the people who make it unique. But that makes me wonder, how do nations decide who belongs? I mean, it's got to be more complicated than just being born there, right?
You've hit on something really interesting. Our sources highlight a few different ways nations approach citizenship. Some, like the United States, they mainly use just possoi, meaning if you're born on their soil, you're a citizen. Doesn't matter where your parents are from.
Right. So in those places, being born within its borders is like automatic citizenship. You're in from day one. What are some other ways they decide who belongs?
Many countries, especially in Europe, they rely more on just sanguinis, which is citizenship based on bloodlines, your ancestry.
So it's like inheriting your nationality. You're a citizen because your parents or grandparents were, even if you weren't born there yourself.
Exactly. And then there's naturalization, which is a legal process where you become a citizen later in life. Usually involves living there for a certain amount of time, maybe passing a language test.
Okay, so if territory is the where and people are the who, then sovereignty is the how. How a nation governs itself, makes decisions, interacts with other nations.
You got it. Internally, sovereignty means a nation has the power to create and enforce its own laws within its own territory. Like being the referee in your own backyard, what happens there is up to you.
So no other country can just waltz in and start like imposing its rules. A nation gets to decide what happens within its own borders.
Exactly. And externally, sovereignty means that other nations acknowledge and respect that nation's independence. It can make treaties, form alliances, strike trade deals, basically. It gets to choose how it wants to play on the world stage.
So it's like being an independent adult in the global community. You get to make your own choices, decide your own path.
That's a great way to put it. But as you can imagine, in our crazy interconnected world, this whole national sovereignty thing, it's facing some serious challenges these days.
I bet. Think about globalization. International trade deals, the internet, even stuff like social media, it all kind of blurs the lines between nations, doesn't it?
You're hitting on some really important points. The rise of global organizations like the UN, these huge multinational corporations with influence that spans borders, and the speed at which information spreads online, it makes it pretty hard for any nation to be totally isolated anymore.
Right, because in a world where countries are constantly interacting, sharing ideas, and even depending on each other, can a nation really be an island unto itself? It's a fascinating thing to think about. But how does that actually play out in the real world? How does globalization actually challenge a nation's sovereignty, like practically speaking?
We'll take international trade agreements as an example. Often these agreements require nations to adopt certain economic or labor policies, even if those policies aren't that popular back home.
So a nation might have to compromise on some of its internal policies if it wants to play in the global marketplace. It's like joining a club. Sometimes you got to follow rules you don't love to get the benefits of being a member, right?
Exactly. And then you have international organizations like the World Trade Organization. They can impose sanctions or penalties on nations that don't follow the rules of international trade.
That's a pretty big stick. Seems like the line between a nation's internal business and its international obligations, well, it's definitely getting blurrier all the time.
It's one of the defining issues of our time. But let's not forget, even with these external pressures, a nation still needs a way to govern itself, right? To make decisions, implement policies. And that's where the role of government comes into play. It's like we're getting into the nuts and bolts of how a nation actually works, right? I mean, it's one thing to talk about territory and people and sovereignty, but you've got to have a way to manage all that.
You need some kind of operating system, right? So when we talk about the role of government, what are we really talking about? Like, what's its purpose?
Man, people have been debating that question for centuries. But I think at its core, you can think of a government as the machinery that allows a nation to actually function and hopefully do well. It's responsible for everything from keeping things in order and safe to providing those public services, making sure people are generally taken care of.
So it's more than just like making laws and taking taxes, although I'm sure those are important parts of the job.
Well, absolutely. Think about all the things we depend on the government for: education, healthcare, all that infrastructure stuff like roads and bridges, even those safety nets for folks who are struggling. Those are the things that really make a nation livable, help it thrive.
Right. Like it's the difference between having a house and having a home. A house is just a structure, but a home needs electricity and running water, a roof that doesn't leak, all that good stuff. Governments, they provide those essential services that make a nation more than just a plot of land.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just the bare necessities too, right? Governments, they have a role in shaping the future of a nation too, boosting the economy, protecting the environment, even encouraging new ideas and technology.
So governments can be like guardians, protecting their citizens, or referees, making sure things are fair, settling disputes, that kind of thing, or even architects, designing a vision for what the nation can become. That's a ton of responsibility. No wonder people have such different opinions about how much power a government should actually have.
That's where that whole debate about minimalist night watchman states versus more interventionist governments comes in. You have some people who believe a government's role should be super limited, just basic security, enforcing agreements, that kind of thing. And then you have others who argue that government should be more active, regulating the economy, providing social welfare, tackling issues like inequality. It's a whole thing.
So it's a spectrum from governments that mostly focus on protecting individual freedom, letting the market do its thing, all the way to governments that take a more hands-on approach to influencing society, promoting social good, that sort of thing. I imagine different nations fall at different spots on that spectrum depending on their values.
For sure. One size doesn't fit all when it comes to this stuff. The level of government involvement in a nation, it's often influenced by its past, its culture, political views, even economic circumstances. Like if you look at some Scandinavian countries, you'll see a much stronger social safety net and more emphasis on government-provided healthcare and education than you might see in other parts of the world.
Right. It's all about context. Right. Makes sense. But no matter how much power a government has, it still needs structure. It needs a way to organize itself. How do nations typically do that?
That's where we get into the whole world of political systems. One of the biggest distinctions is between monarchies and republics.
Ah, the classic rulers by birth versus rulers by the people. Man, this takes me back to history class. Good times.
Exactly. In a monarchy, the head honcho is a king or queen. Their position is usually passed down through family. Think the UK or Saudi Arabia. On the flip side, you've got republics where the leader is usually an elected president or prime minister. Their power comes from, well, the people. Places like the US, France, India, they're all republics.
So it's about where the ultimate power comes from a single person because of who their parents were or the people through voting. Makes sense. But even within republics, there are different ways to divvy up that power, right?
Absolutely. That's where we get into federalism versus unitary systems. They're two of the most common ways nations structure their governments.
Okay, full disclosure. I've always been kind of fuzzy on those terms. They always sounded so, I don't know, political science-y. Can you break them down for us regular folks? What's the difference?
Totally. Think of it like this. In a federal system, power is split between a central government and regional governments, like a layer cake where each layer has its own specific responsibilities.
So you've got the federal government at the top, calling the shots for the whole country, and then you have states or provinces underneath handling things on a more local level, like here in the U.S., right?
You got it. The U.S., with its balance between the feds in Washington and the individual state governments, that's a classic example of federalism. Germany, too, where you have the federal government and those powerful lender or states.
So with a federal system, there's this constant back and forth, right? Different levels of government, each trying to exert their own authority.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it can lead to both teamwork and some disagreements, depending on the issue. But the core idea is that power is shared, which could be a good way to handle diversity and those different regional interests you get in a big country.
Like having different chefs responsible for different parts of a menu. You might have one for appetizers, one for entrees, one for desserts, right? Allows for specialization and makes sure everyone gets something they like.
Love that analogy. Now, contrast that with a unitary system, where power is mostly concentrated in the central government. Think of it more like a pie chart, with the central government taking the biggest slice. Local governments might exist, sure, but they ultimately get their power from the central government.
So in a unitary system, it's the central government calling the shots. It's like having one head chef who oversees everything, even if they have sous chefs helping out in the kitchen. What are some examples of those?
France and Japan are good examples of unitary states. In France, you have that strong central government in Paris. And even though they have regions, those regions have way less autonomy than states do here in the US, for instance.
Okay, so federalism is all about sharing power, and a unitary system is about centralizing it. Seems like there are pluses and minuses to both approaches. But what does it actually mean for, everyday people? How does one system affect their lives differently than the other?
Great question. Let's stick with the education example. In a federal system, like here in the US, education policy is largely decided at the state level. That means things like educational standards, what's taught in schools, even how schools are funded. It can vary a lot from state to state.
So where you live within a country can have a big impact on your educational opportunities.
Exactly. Now, in a unitary system, like in Japan, education policy is a national thing. That makes things more uniform across the country, which has its own advantages, right? It can help make sure every student, no matter where they live, is getting a good education, meeting certain standards.
Right. So it's about finding that balance between giving local communities a say and having some level of national consistency. No easy answers, huh? Sounds like the best system really depends on the specific country and what it's dealing with.
Exactly. There's no such thing as a perfect system. Federalism and unitary systems, they both have their strengths and weaknesses. Federalism's great for embracing diversity, giving regions more autonomy, but it can struggle with efficiency, making sure everyone's on the same page. Unitary systems, they can be more efficient, and they might promote national unity, but they might not be so responsive to the needs of specific regions or communities. It's a trade-off.
Like choosing between a Swiss Army knife and a chef's knife, right?
Yeah.
One's versatile, the other specialized. The best tool depends on the job you need to do.
I like that. And it's important to remember that these systems aren't frozen in time. They change and adapt to new situations and what society needs. But like we were talking about earlier, building a successful nation, it takes more than just a working government and a well-defined political system. There are deeper issues at play.
Right. All those cracks in the foundation we talked about. Even with the best blueprints and the most skilled builders, things can still go wrong.
Totally. And that's where the whole concept of a failed state comes in. It's a term people throw around a lot, but our sources make it clear that it's a much more complicated issue than simply slapping a failure label on a country.
Okay, so let's talk about those situations when nations falter. What are some warning signs that a nation might be headed for trouble? What are some things that can cause a state to fail? It's almost like nations are like, I don't know, living things, right? They can be healthy and doing well, or they can struggle, all depending on so many different factors. So when we say failed state, it's not like something just suddenly breaks. It's more of a slow burn.
That's a good way to put it. It's not like flipping a switch, right?
Right, yeah.
Our sources really emphasize that state failure is a process.
Yeah.
Like a bunch of different stresses and weaknesses piling up until eventually the nation can't really function anymore.
Okay, so less of a sudden collapse and more of a slow unraveling. What are some of the, I don't know, the threads that start to come loose first? What should we be watching out for?
Well, our sources break it down into three main categories: social, economic, and political. Let's start with the social stuff. Imagine a country that's dealing with massive population growth. Way more people than resources.
Like way more people than jobs or housing or schools or hospitals.
Yeah.
That would put a strain on everything.
Exactly. And then on top of that, toss in something like mass displacement of people, maybe from conflict or natural disasters. Now you've got millions of people on the move, desperate for safety, for basic necessities. It's, well, a recipe for instability.
Right, because that kind of chaos, that upheaval, it can be really hard for a nation to handle. It's like trying to, I don't know, bail out a boat that's taking on water faster than you can scoop it out.
That's a perfect analogy. And it gets even more complicated. Add in things like deeply rooted social resentments. Long-held tensions between different ethnic or religious groups, stuff that's been brewing for years.
That kind of stuff can fester, right? And if it's not addressed, it can explode, really tear a nation apart. Like ignoring a crack in a bridge, eventually it's going to collapse.
Exactly. And to make things even worse, imagine something called brain drain happening at the same time.
Brain drain. Is that when all the smart, educated people start leaving a country? Like they see better opportunities somewhere else, so they take their skills and go?
Exactly. Doctors, engineers, scientists, entrepreneurs, they pack up and leave, which is a huge loss for a nation that's already struggling to solve a bunch of other problems.
Sounds like, I don't know, losing all your best mechanics just when your car starts falling apart. Not a good situation to be in. Okay, so we've got these social problems building up. What about the economics of it all?
Right, well, that's where things like widespread poverty, huge gaps between the rich and the poor, and, of course, just prolonged economic decline come into play. Those are major factors.
Those all seem, well, pretty self-explanatory, but how do they actually weaken a nation?
Think about it. If a huge chunk of the population is living in poverty, barely scraping by, it creates this environment of desperation. People lose faith in the system, they lose hope. It's a breeding ground for, well, trouble.
Yeah, when people feel like they've got nothing left to lose, they're more likely to, I don't know, take desperate measures, support extreme solutions, or even turn to violence. It's a vicious cycle.
Exactly. And then you add an extreme economic inequality on top of that. A small group has all the wealth and everyone else is struggling. That breeds resentment, social unrest, and that often spills over into the political sphere.
Right. It creates that us versus them mentality, which is never good for a healthy society. It's like, I don't know, trying to build a house on a foundation that's half crumbling.
A very good analogy.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the political stuff. And honestly, this is often what people notice first. The most visible signs that a nation is in trouble.
This is where you see things like governments losing control of their own territory, right? Like when armed groups or criminal organizations start having more power than the actual government.
Exactly. When a government can't govern effectively anymore, when it can't enforce the law or even keep its citizens safe, it loses all legitimacy. People stop trusting it. Other nations stop taking it seriously. It's in a very precarious position.
And that loss of legitimacy is dangerous. It creates this void where things can go really bad really quickly.
And those solutions are often not pretty. You might see a rise in authoritarianism, crackdowns on human rights, worst case scenario, a total collapse of governance, which usually leads to chaos and violence. It's not great.
It's heavy stuff, but it's so important to understand. It's easy to simplify these situations, to point the finger at one leader or one event.
That's why it's so important to look beyond the headlines, to dig into the social, the economic, and the political things that make a nation fragile in the first place, to recognize those warning signs early on. And most importantly, to remember that building and maintaining a successful nation, it's an ongoing process. It takes constant work.
It's like, what's that saying? Rome wasn't built in a day.
Exactly. And it didn't fall in a day either. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
This whole deep dive has been honestly pretty eye-opening. We've gone from ancient philosophers to the biggest challenges facing the world today, all to try and understand this idea of a nation.
And hopefully it's given you, our listener, a new appreciation for just how complex nations really are, the challenges they face, but also their resilience, their ability to adapt and evolve. It's pretty incredible when you think about it.
It really is. And you know what? It reminds us that we live in a world where everything is connected. And understanding those connections is more important than ever. So next time you see a headline about some kind of political crisis or economic turmoil or social movement, think back to what we talked about today. Remember those building blocks of a nation, the territory, the people, the sovereignty, the government, and all those other social and economic forces that are constantly pushing and pulling. It's all connected.
Because knowledge is power, right? The more you understand about how nations work, the better equipped you are to understand the world around you.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for coming along on this journey with us as we dove into what makes a nation tick. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing. We'll catch you on our next deep dive.